Man alone opened his door to the wrong woman. At dawn, the tribe declared him guilty of treachery. The first 3 knocks came soft as whispers against weathered pine. Colt Brennan's calloused fingers froze around his coffee mug, steam rising between him and the dying embers of his fireplace. Outside his cabin, Wyoming wind howled through autumn pines like the voices of restless spirits. He had built this place far from civilization for a reason, 20 miles from the nearest settlement, 40 from the tribal lands that bordered the mountain passes. No one knocked on his door at midnight. No one even knew where to find him. The knocks came again, more urgent this time, desperate. Colt set down his mug and reached for the Winchester leaning against the stone hearth. His bare feet made no sound against the rough wooden floor as he approached the heavy oak door. Through the single window, darkness pressed against the glass like black velvet. The storm had been building all evening, and now fat snowflakes danced in the lamplight spilling from his cabin. "Who's there?" His voice carried the authority of a man who had spent 15 years as a cavalry officer before choosing exile over the politics of war. Silence answered him. Then, barely audible above the wind, came a woman's voice. "Please, I need help." Colt's grip tightened on his rifle. In 3 years of living alone in these mountains, he had learned to trust his instincts above all else. Something felt wrong about this moment. The timing, the location, the vulnerability in that feminine plea. But the temperature had dropped below freezing, and the nearest shelter was a day's hard ride through treacherous terrain. He slid back the heavy wooden bolt and opened the door a crack. The woman standing on his porch looked like she had walked through hell itself. Auburn hair hung in wet tangles around a face marked by exhaustion and something deeper, a haunted quality that spoke of recent trauma. Her dress, once fine blue wool, was torn at the sleeves and stained with mud and what might have been blood. She clutched a tattered shawl around shoulders that shook with more than just cold. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. Green as spring grass, they held secrets that made his soldier's instincts scream warnings. Yet beneath the mystery lay genuine terror, and Colt had never been able to turn away from someone in need. "Ma'am." He lowered his rifle but kept it ready. "You're a long way from anywhere." "My horse threw me," she said, her voice carrying the refined accent of Eastern education. "I've been walking for hours. The storm came up so fast, and I saw your light." She swayed on her feet, and Colt found himself stepping forward to steady her. The moment his hand touched her arm, she looked up at him with an expression that seemed to catalog every detail of his face. Something flickered in those green eyes. Relief, perhaps, or recognition. "Come in before you freeze to death." He stepped aside, though every nerve in his body remained alert. She crossed the threshold with the careful steps of someone fighting exhaustion. In the lamplight, Colt could see she was younger than he had first thought, perhaps 20, with the kind of refined beauty that belonged in drawing rooms, not wandering alone through hostile wilderness. "Thank you." She turned to face him, and he caught a glimpse of something else in her expression. Calculation. It was there and gone so quickly he might have imagined it. "I'm Evangeline Morrison. I was traveling to meet my intended in Cheyenne when bandits attacked our party." The name Morrison carried weight in these parts. Old railroad money with interests in cattle and mining. If this woman was part of that family, her disappearance would bring significant attention. The kind of attention Colt had spent 3 years avoiding. Colt Brennan. He secured the door and set his rifle aside, though he remained standing. "You're bleeding." Evangeline looked down at her torn sleeve with surprise, as if noticing the wound for the first time. Dark blood had soaked through the fabric, and her skin was pale from cold and blood loss. "It's nothing serious," she said, but her voice wavered. "Sit by the fire. I'll get some supplies." Colt moved to his modest kitchen area, keeping her in his peripheral vision as he gathered clean cloth and his medical kit. 15 years in the cavalry had taught him to treat wounds efficiently, but he had also learned to read people. Evangeline Morrison was not what she appeared to be. She settled into the chair closest to the fireplace, her movements graceful despite her claimed ordeal. As she pulled off her muddy boots, Colt noticed they were expensive, hand-stitched leather that would cost most men a month's wages. But more telling were her hands. Soft, unmarked by manual labor, with nails that had been recently manicured. This was not a woman who had spent hours walking through rough terrain, yet the blood was real. The exhaustion appeared genuine. And outside, the storm continued to build, making travel impossible until morning. "Tell me about these bandits," Colt said as he approached with the medical supplies. Evangeline hesitated just long enough for him to notice. There were 4 of them. They came out of nowhere, just after we crossed Willow Creek. They killed our driver and guard, took everything valuable. "And left you alive?" I ran. Her green eyes met his steadily. "I hid in the rocks until they gave up looking for me." It was plausible. Barely. But Colt had spent enough time in Indian country to know that bandits rarely left witnesses, especially beautiful young women who could identify them later. He knelt beside her chair and gently pushed back her torn sleeve. The wound was deep but clean, more like a knife cut than something caused by rough terrain or desperate flight. As he cleaned it with whiskey, Evangeline barely flinched, showing the kind of stoicism that spoke of familiarity with pain. "You're very calm for someone who just survived a massacre," he observed. "I've learned that panic serves no purpose." Her voice was steady, but he caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "My father taught me to keep my wits during crisis." "Smart man. What business brings a Morrison to Cheyenne?" "Marriage." The word came out flat, devoid of emotion. An arrangement between families. The gentleman owned several silver mines in Colorado. As Colt bandaged her arm, he found himself studying her profile in the firelight. Beautiful, certainly, but there was steel beneath that delicate exterior. This was not a pampered society girl who would crumble under pressure. Whatever game she was playing, she was dangerous. "You can take my bed tonight," he said, finishing with the bandage. "I'll make do with the floor." "That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to impose. It's 20 below outside, and the storm won't break until morning. You'll freeze in that dress, and I won't have a woman's death on my conscience." Evangeline smiled, and for the first time, it seemed genuine. "You're not what I expected." "Expected?" She caught herself, color rising in her cheeks. "I mean, living alone out here, most men might take advantage of the situation." "I'm not most men." "No," she said quietly, studying his face with those penetrating green eyes. "You're not." Colt retrieved a clean shirt and woolen pants from his dresser. "These will be large on you, but they're warm and dry. There's privacy behind that curtain." As Evangeline disappeared behind the makeshift partition, Colt found himself pacing the small cabin like a caged wolf. Something about this situation felt orchestrated, but he couldn't identify the trap. If she was lying about the bandits, what was she really doing in his mountains? And why did she look at him like she already knew more about him than she should? The wind rattled his windows, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled its loneliness to the storm. Colt had chosen isolation to escape the complications of civilization, but it seemed civilization had found him anyway. "Mr. Brennan?" Evangeline's voice came from behind the curtain. "I'm afraid I need help with the buttons." He approached the partition carefully. "Are you decent?" "Mostly." She emerged wearing his oversized shirt, the fabric hanging nearly to her knees. Her auburn hair fell loose around her shoulders, and without the formal styling, she looked even younger. But her eyes remained those of someone who had seen too much of the world's darkness. "The arm makes it difficult," she explained, indicating the bandaged wound. Colt moved behind her to work the small buttons, his calloused fingers awkward with the delicate task. This close, he could smell lavender in her hair, an expensive perfume that seemed incongruous with her story of desperate flight through the wilderness. "There." He stepped back quickly, disturbed by his awareness of her proximity. "Thank you." She turned to face him, and something shifted in the air between them. "You're very gentle for a man who lives like a hermit." Early morning comes whether we sleep or not. You should rest." But Evangeline made no move toward the bedroom. Instead, she settled back into the chair by the fire, tucking her legs beneath her like a cat seeking warmth. "I'm not sure I can sleep yet." The adrenaline, you understand. Colt understood more than she knew. He had spent enough nights after battle unable to close his eyes, replaying violence in his mind until exhaustion finally claimed him. But Evangeline Morrison showed no signs of the jumpiness that usually followed genuine trauma. "What did you do before you came here?" she asked. "This and that." "You have the bearing of a soldier." Colt's jaw tightened. "Lady, with respect, it's late and you've had a hard day. Questions can wait until morning." Instead of being offended by his abruptness, Evangeline smiled again. "You're right, of course. I apologize for prying." But she continued to watch him with those calculating green eyes, and Colt found himself moving to the window to stare out at the storm. Snow was falling harder now, building drifts against his cabin walls. Even if she was lying about everything else, she was trapped here until the weather cleared. "Mr. Brennan?" Her voice was softer now, almost vulnerable. "May I ask you something personal?" Every instinct screamed at him to shut down this conversation, but he found himself nodding. "Do you ever regret choosing this life? Living apart from everyone?" The question caught him off guard with its sincerity. For a moment, the mysterious woman in his cabin became simply someone seeking understanding about the choices that led people into wilderness exile. "Some choices can't be undone," he said finally. "You learn to live with them. Even when they mean complete isolation, sometimes isolation is preferable to the alternative." Evangeline was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that seemed too heavy for her 20 years. "I understand that more than you might think." Something in her tone made him turn from the window. In profile, with firelight playing across her features, she looked genuinely sad. Not calculating or mysterious, but deeply melancholy. "What are you running from, Miss Morrison?" She looked up at him sharply. "What makes you think I'm running from anything?" Woman traveling alone, expensive clothes torn up, convenient story about bandits. And you're asking philosophical questions about exile at midnight. Either you're running from something, or you're not who you claim to be. For several heartbeats, they stared at each other across the small cabin. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, and the fire crackled in the silence between them. "Perhaps both," she said finally. Before Colt could respond, a new sound cut through the storm, the distant but unmistakable rhythm of hoofbeats approaching through the snow. Multiple horses, moving fast despite the conditions. Evangeline's face went white. "They found me." Colt was already reaching for his rifle. "Who found you?" "The men I'm running from." She stood quickly, moving to the window beside him. "They've been tracking me for 3 days." "I thought you said bandits attacked your party." "I lied." Her voice was tight with fear. "These aren't bandits, and they're not here for money." The hoofbeats were closer now, perhaps half a mile out. In this weather, riders would be nearly on top of the cabin before they could be seen clearly. "Who are they?" Colt demanded. Evangeline turned to face him, and he saw something in her eyes that chilled him more than the Wyoming wind. The look of someone who had just signed both their death warrants. "Crow warriors," she whispered. "And they think you helped me steal their sacred medicine bundle." The words hit Colt like a physical blow. Sacred objects were not mere possessions to the Crow people. They were spiritual artifacts that connected the tribe to their ancestors and the spirit world. Stealing such items was not just theft, but sacrilege, an act that could bring war between peoples. "What exactly did you steal?" His voice was deadly quiet. "The Thunder Bundle. It was taken from a medicine man during a raid on their winter camp." She was speaking quickly now, urgency making her words tumble together. "My employer wanted it for his private collection. I was hired to retrieve it from the man who originally stole it." "Your employer?" "Colonel Harrison Blackwood. He collects Indian artifacts for wealthy Eastern buyers." Colt knew that name. Blackwood had been a cavalry officer like himself, but one who had profited from the Indian Wars by selling artifacts and information to the highest bidders. The man had no honor, no respect for the cultures he exploited. And now the Crow think I'm part of this. It wasn't a question. They followed my trail directly to your door. In their eyes, you're harboring a thief. Evangeline moved away from the window, her earlier composure cracking. They don't negotiate when it comes to sacred objects. The hoofbeats were very close now. Colt estimated at least 6 riders, possibly more. He had fought alongside Crow warriors during the Indian Wars and knew them to be fierce, intelligent fighters who would not be easily discouraged. Where is this bundle now? Hidden in the rocks about a mile north of here. I was going to retrieve it after the storm passed. And you led them straight to my cabin. I had no choice. I was freezing, and I saw your light. You had a choice. Colt's voice cut through her explanation like a blade. You could have kept running instead of dragging an innocent man into your mess. The sound of horses stopped just outside his door. In the sudden silence, Colt could hear voices speaking in the Crow language, low, urgent tones that suggested men preparing for violence. They're going to kill us both, Evangeline whispered. Maybe. Colt checked his rifle and moved to his gun cabinet, pulling out a shotgun and extra ammunition. Or maybe there's still a way to fix this. What are you doing? What I should have done the moment you knocked on my door, telling the truth. Before Evangeline could protest, Colt opened the cabin door and stepped onto his porch, hands visible but weapons ready. 6 Crow warriors sat their horses in his yard, snow swirling around them like ghosts. Their leader, a man Colt recognized as Joseph Iron Hawk, wore war paint beneath his heavy buffalo coat. Iron Hawk, Colt called out in the Crow language, his pronunciation careful but clear. You honor my home with your presence. The warrior's eyes narrowed with surprise. Few white men bothered to learn proper Crow protocols, and fewer still would open a conversation with traditional greeting when facing armed enemies. Colt Brennan, Iron Hawk replied in heavily accented English. You know why we have come. I know you seek justice for a great wrong. But I also know you are men of honor who listen before they strike. The woman is in your house. The bundle's trail ends at your door. The woman came to me seeking shelter from the storm. I gave aid as one human to another, but I did not know of her crime until this moment. Iron Hawk studied Colt's face in the lamplight spilling from the cabin. Behind the warrior, his companions remained mounted but ready, their weapons gleaming with snow and reflected flame. You ask us to believe you are innocent? I ask you to judge me by my actions, not by the actions of others. In 3 years, have I ever given your people cause for distrust? This was true, and Iron Hawk knew it. Colt had gone out of his way to avoid conflict with the local tribes, even trading fairly with hunting parties when their paths crossed. He had earned a reputation as one of the few white men in the territory who showed proper respect for Indian customs. The woman bears the mark of the Thunder People, one of the other warriors said, pointing at the cabin. She has touched what is sacred. Then let her answer for her crimes, Colt replied. But judge each person by their own actions. Iron Hawk dismounted and approached the porch, his hand resting on his knife handle. Up close, Colt could see the ritual scars on the warrior's face, marks that identified him as a member of the Thunder Clan, the very group whose sacred bundle had been stolen. Where is the Thunder Bundle now? Colt glanced back at his open door, where Evangeline stood listening to every word. Her face was pale with fear, but her eyes still held that calculating quality that made him distrust her completely. The woman claims it is hidden in the rocks to the north. She says she was hired by Colonel Blackwood to steal it from another thief. Blackwood, Iron Hawk spat in the snow. That one has no honor. He sells our ancestors' spirits to men who keep them in glass boxes. If you let me, I will help you recover your sacred bundle. The woman will answer to your justice, but let her crimes not fall on an innocent man. Iron Hawk considered this offer, his dark eyes moving between Colt and the cabin door. The other warriors remained mounted, but Colt could see them growing restless. Young men, probably eager for vengeance after days of tracking through harsh weather. You would help us against your own kind? I would help you recover what is sacred to your people. Justice serves everyone. And the woman? Colt looked back at Evangeline, seeing her clearly for the first time since she had knocked on his door. Beautiful, dangerous, and willing to sacrifice others to save herself. Whatever sympathies he had felt for her plight evaporated in the face of her deception. The woman made her own choices. Let her face the consequences. Evangeline's green eyes went wide with shock and betrayal, but before she could speak, Iron Hawk raised his hand. We will consider your offer, Colt Brennan. But first, the woman must be questioned. There are others involved in this theft, others who must answer for their crimes. I understand. Step aside. Colt looked back at Evangeline one more time, seeing genuine fear replace her earlier calculation. Part of him, the part that had been raised to protect women and innocents, rebelled against handing her over to warriors, whose ideas of justice were often harsh and final. But she had made her choice when she knocked on his door, and he had made his when he chose exile over the corruptions of civilization. Some lines could not be crossed without consequences. He stepped aside. Ironhawk entered the cabin with two of his warriors, their presence transforming the small space into something charged with danger. Evangeline backed against the stone fireplace, her borrowed shirt hanging loose around her small frame. Evangeline Morrison, Ironhawk said her name like a curse. You have stolen from the Thunder People. I was hired to retrieve stolen property, she replied, her voice steadier than Colt would have expected. I'm not a thief, I'm a recovery specialist. You steal our ancestors' medicine for white men who treat sacred things like trophies. I return stolen artifacts to their rightful owners. The bundle was taken in a raid 6 months ago. I was hired to get it back. Ironhawk's face darkened with anger. Lies. The bundle was kept safe in our winter camp until your people attacked us. 8 of our elders died defending it. Evangeline's composure finally cracked. That's not what I was told. Blackwood said the bundle was already stolen, that I was helping return it. Blackwood lies like all his kind. You helped him murder our elders and steal our most sacred medicine. The weight of this revelation settled over the cabin like a suffocating blanket. Evangeline Morrison was not simply a thief. She was an accomplice to mass murder, complicit in an attack that had killed respected tribal elders and stolen irreplaceable spiritual artifacts. Colt felt sick. He had given shelter to someone whose crimes went far beyond simple theft. In the eyes of the Crow people, she was a war criminal deserving of the harshest punishment their justice could provide. I didn't know, Evangeline whispered, tears beginning to track down her cheeks. I swear to you, I didn't know about the elders. Blackwood told me it was a simple recovery job. Ignorance does not wash blood from your hands, Ironhawk replied coldly. Outside, the storm continued to rage, trapping all of them together in a small space filled with the weight of ancient grievances and fresh betrayals. Colt realized that his quiet life of exile was over, shattered by a woman's lies and a sacred bundle hidden somewhere in the frozen rocks. But more than that, he understood that whatever happened in the next few hours would determine not just his own fate, but the fragile peace that existed between the white settlers and the Crow Nation in this remote corner of Wyoming territory. The wrong word, the wrong action, could ignite a war that would consume everything he had tried to build in these mountains. And dawn was still hours away. Where exactly is the bundle hidden? Ironhawk's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. Evangeline wiped her tears with the back of her hand, leaving streaks across her dirt-stained cheeks. North of here, maybe a mile. There's a formation of red rocks shaped like a buffalo skull. I hid it in a cave behind the formation. You will show us. In this storm, we'll all freeze to death before we find it. Ironhawk exchanged glances with his warriors. The youngest of them, barely out of his teens, stepped forward with the eagerness of youth seeking to prove himself. "Let me go, Uncle. I know those rocks. Even in the snow, I can find them." "No, Running Wolf. The storm is too dangerous, and the woman may be lying about the location." Ironhawk turned back to Evangeline. "We wait until first light. But if you have deceived us about where the bundle is hidden, your death will not be quick." Colt watched this exchange with growing unease. He had dealt with enough Crow warriors to know that Ironhawk was showing remarkable restraint. By tribal law, Evangeline's crimes warranted immediate execution. The fact that they were willing to wait until morning suggested they valued recovering the sacred bundle more than simple vengeance. But morning would bring its own challenges. If the bundle wasn't where Evangeline claimed, or if more of Blackwood's people were in the area, this fragile situation could explode into violence that would spread far beyond his isolated cabin. "Ironhawk," Colt said carefully, "your warriors have been riding hard in this weather. My cabin is small, but I have coffee and dried meat. Honor me by accepting hospitality while we wait for dawn." The offer was strategic. Crow culture placed high value on proper hospitality, and accepting Colt's invitation would create obligations that might prevent hasty violence. It would also keep everyone together where he could monitor the situation. Ironhawk considered the offer, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Finally, he nodded to his warriors. "Bring the horses to the shelter behind the cabin. We accept the hospitality of Colt Brennan." As the warriors moved their mounts to the crude lean-to Colt had built for his own horse, he found himself in the surreal position of hosting both his potential executioner and the woman whose lies had created this deadly situation. Evangeline retreated to the far corner of the cabin as the Crow warriors entered, their presence filling the small space with the scent of snow, leather, and the sage smoke that clung to their clothing from ceremonial fires. Up close, Colt could see the exhaustion in their faces. They had been riding hard through brutal conditions, driven by duty to their murdered elders. "Coffee's hot," Colt said, moving to the stove. "Food's simple but filling." As he prepared the meal, he found himself studying the warriors with professional interest. Ironhawk was clearly the leader, a man in his 40s with the scars and bearing of someone who had fought in many battles. The younger ones, Running Wolf and two others who looked to be brothers, watched everything with the alertness of men expecting trouble. The sixth warrior was the most interesting. Older than the others, with gray threading through his black hair, he carried himself with the dignity of a medicine man or tribal elder. When he looked at Evangeline, his eyes held not just anger but profound sadness. "Grandfather?" Colt addressed him using the respectful term for an elder, speaking in Crow. "You knew the elders who were killed?" The old warrior's eyes sharpened with surprise at Colt's use of their language. "I am Thomas Plenty Horses. My brother was among those who died defending the Thunder Bundle. He was keeper of our winter count, holder of our people's history." The weight of this revelation settled over the cabin like smoke. Winter counts were sacred historical records, pictographic chronicles that preserved tribal history and spiritual knowledge. The loss of such a keeper was a catastrophe that went beyond individual grief. It was the destruction of irreplaceable cultural memory. "I am sorry for your loss, grandfather. Your brother died with honor, protecting what is sacred." Plenty Horses studied Colt's face for a long moment before nodding slowly. "You speak our words correctly. You understand our ways. I tried to show proper respect. Why did you choose to live apart from your own people?" The question caught Colt off guard. He glanced at Evangeline, who was listening to the exchange with obvious confusion. She clearly didn't understand Crow. Ironhawk and the younger warriors were also paying close attention, their expressions suggesting this conversation was more significant than simple small talk. "Sometimes a man must choose between his conscience and his orders," Colt replied carefully. "You were a soldier." "Yes, I served in the cavalry for 15 years. Against our people?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Colt had known this moment would come eventually, the reckoning with his past that exile had delayed but never erased. I fought in battles where good men died on both sides. I followed orders I came to believe were wrong. When I could no longer serve without dishonoring myself, I chose to leave. Plenty Horses translated this exchange for the others, speaking in rapid Crow. Colt caught enough to understand they were discussing his military service and the reasons for his exile. Iron Hawk's expression remained neutral, but the younger warriors looked skeptical. "What battles?" Iron Hawk asked, switching back to English. "Little Bighorn, Wounded Knee, others I would prefer to forget." The names fell into the cabin like stones into still water, creating ripples of recognition and old anger. Little Bighorn had been a victory for the tribes but had led to savage reprisals. Wounded Knee had been a massacre that still haunted everyone who witnessed it. "You were at Wounded Knee?" Running Wolf's voice carried the edge of barely controlled rage. "I was there." Colt met the young warrior's eyes steadily. "I saw things that made me sick to my soul. That's when I knew I could no longer wear the uniform." "What things?" Plenty Horses asked quietly. Colt was silent for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if it held answers to questions he had been avoiding for years. Outside, the wind continued its relentless assault on the cabin walls, and the fire crackled in the silence. "I saw soldiers shoot women and children who were trying to surrender. I saw wounded elders executed where they lay. I saw sacred objects destroyed just to cause pain." He looked up at Plenty Horses. "I saw my own people become something I couldn't recognize or respect. And so you left." "I requested transfer to the frontier. When that wasn't enough, I resigned my commission. When that wasn't enough, I came here to live alone with my choices." Evangeline had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm. As the implications became clear, that Colt had been present at some of the most notorious conflicts between whites and Indians, her face went pale. "You never told me you fought against Indians," she said. "Lady, you never asked. And considering you've been lying since you knocked on my door, you're in no position to complain about selective honesty." Iron Hawk watched this exchange with interest. "The woman fears our justice more than the storm." "The woman should fear justice," Colt replied. 8 elders died because of her actions. I didn't know. Evangeline's voice cracked with desperation. "I keep telling you, I thought I was recovering stolen property. Blackwood told me the bundle was taken in a raid months ago. He said the original owners wanted it back." "Blackwood lies," Iron Hawk said flatly. "He pays raiders to attack our camps, then sells what they steal to collectors in the East. You were not recovering stolen property. You were stealing sacred medicine fresh from the blood of our murdered elders." The brutal truth of this accusation hit Evangeline like a physical blow. She slumped against the cabin wall, the weight of her unwitting complicity in mass murder finally breaking through her defenses. "How many others work for Blackwood?" Plenty Horses asked her. "I don't know. He hires different people for different jobs. I've only worked for him twice, once to recover a war bonnet from a private collector in Denver, and now this." "The war bonnet," Iron Hawk said sharply. "Describe it." "Eagle feathers with ermine trim, beaded headband with thunderbird designs. It belonged to someone called Chief Many Horses." The warriors exchanged grim looks. Running Wolf spoke rapid crow to Iron Hawk, his voice tight with anger. "That bonnet belonged to my grandfather," Iron Hawk said. "It was taken from his grave 3 winters ago. Blackwood sold our ancestors' burial goods to white men who display them like hunting trophies." The scope of Blackwood's crimes was becoming clear. He wasn't just stealing individual artifacts, he was systematically looting Native American cultural heritage, turning sacred objects into commodities for wealthy collectors who saw them as exotic curiosities rather than spiritually significant items. "How do we find Blackwood?" Colt asked. Iron Hawk looked at him sharply. "We? This woman's lies have made me part of this whether I want to be or not. Your people's justice demands accountability from all who participated in these crimes." If I'm going to clear my name, I need to help you stop the man who's really responsible. You would fight against your own kind again? Blackwood isn't my kind. He's a disgrace to every uniform he ever wore and every oath he ever took. If he's murdering elders and stealing sacred objects, he needs to face justice. Plenty Horses studied Colt with the penetrating gaze of someone who had spent decades reading the intentions of men. You seek redemption. I seek to do what's right. Maybe that's the same thing. Blackwood has a ranch 30 miles southeast of here, Evangeline said quietly. He keeps his collection there until he can arrange shipment to buyers in Chicago and New York. How many men does he have? Iron Hawk asked. At least 20. Former soldiers mostly, like himself. Men who know how to fight. And they know these mountains? Some of them. He's been operating here for 2 years. Iron Hawk and Plenty Horses conferred in rapid crow. Colt caught enough to understand they were discussing tactics and the wisdom of attacking a fortified position with only 6 warriors. We cannot assault such a place with our numbers, Iron Hawk concluded, but we cannot let him continue to murder our people and steal our sacred objects. Maybe we don't need to assault it, Colt said. Maybe we can make him come to us. How? Colt looked at Evangeline, an idea forming in his mind. It was dangerous, requiring him to trust a woman who had already proven herself a liar. But it might be their only chance to stop Blackwood without starting a war that would consume the entire territory. She was supposed to deliver the bundle to him. What if she still does, but with a different cargo? Understanding dawned in Iron Hawk's eyes. A trap. She leads him to the bundle's hiding place. But instead of sacred medicine, he finds 6 crow warriors and 1 very angry ex-cavalry officer. And if she betrays us, then we're no worse off than we are now. At least we'd know where Blackwood is. Evangeline had been following this conversation with growing horror. You want to use me as bait? He'll kill me when he realizes what happened. Lady, 8 elders are already dead because of your work. At this point, your survival is less important than stopping a man who's turning murder and theft into a business. I have information that could help you. Blackwood's routines, his security measures, the layout of his ranch. Isn't that worth something? It might be, Iron Hawk said. But trust must be earned, and you have given us no reason to trust you. What if I helped you recover not just the Thunder Bundle, but everything he's stolen? He has artifacts from a dozen tribes, sacred pipes, medicine bundles, burial goods, ceremonial weapons. Wouldn't getting all of it back be worth more than just killing me? Colt had to admit the offer had merit. If Blackwood really was operating on the scale Evangeline described, his collection would represent cultural treasures from across the entire region. Recovering those items would serve justice for many tribes, not just the Crow. But it would also require trusting a woman who had already proven herself capable of elaborate deception. The bundle first, Iron Hawk decided. At dawn, she shows us where it is hidden. If she speaks truth about that, we consider her other offer. If she lies, he didn't need to finish the threat. Everyone in the cabin understood that Evangeline's life hung by the thinnest of threads, dependent entirely on whether the sacred Thunder Bundle was where she claimed to have hidden it. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating, but the eastern horizon was beginning to show the faintest suggestion of approaching dawn. In a few hours, they would all venture out into the frozen wilderness to recover an artifact whose theft had already cost 8 lives. And if Evangeline Morrison had lied about its location, the death toll would rise to include her own, and possibly Colt's as well, since he had chosen to involve himself in a conflict that had been raging long before she knocked on his cabin door. The die was cast. Dawn would bring either justice or bloodshed, and possibly both. Dawn came like a reluctant witness to judgment, painting the Wyoming sky the color of old blood. The storm had finally exhausted itself sometime during the long night, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and ice. Colt stood at his cabin window, watching the sun climb over mountains that looked like sleeping giants wrapped in white burial shrouds. Behind him, the unlikely assembly prepared for what could be their final journey together. Ironhawk and his warriors checked their weapons with the methodical care of men who understood that survival depended on preparation. Evangeline sat by the dying fire, wrapped in Colt's heavy coat, her face pale but determined. "The rocks are treacherous when they're iced," she said, breaking the silence that had settled over the cabin like morning mist. "We'll need to rope ourselves together if we want to reach the cave safely." "You seem to know a lot about mountain climbing for an artifact recovery specialist," Colt observed. "My father believed young ladies should be capable of taking care of themselves. I learned to climb before I learned to embroider." It was the first thing she had said about her past that rang completely true. There was a confidence in her voice when she spoke of physical challenges that had been missing from her other explanations. "Your father sounds like a wise man," Plenty Horses said. "What happened to him?" Evangeline's expression darkened. "He died 3 years ago. Lung fever took him during a harsh winter in Colorado. That's when I started working for men like Blackwood. I needed money, and I had skills that were valuable to collectors." Outside, the world had grown bright with reflected sunlight off fresh snow. The temperature was still well below freezing, but the wind had died to occasional gusts that barely stirred the pine boughs. "Time to go," Ironhawk announced. "The longer we wait, the more likely Blackwood becomes suspicious." They prepared for the journey with the efficiency of people who understood that winter mountains showed no mercy to the unprepared. Colt gathered rope, extra clothing, and emergency supplies while the warriors readied their horses for difficult travel through deep snow. The ride north took nearly 2 hours through snow that sometimes reached their horses' bellies. The landscape was breathtaking in its austere beauty, endless white punctuated by dark stands of pine and the occasional red sandstone formation that thrust up from the earth like ancient monuments. Evangeline rode between Ironhawk and Colt, her hands tied to her saddle horn as a precaution against attempted escape. She guided them through terrain that would have been challenging even in good weather, pointing out hazards and suggesting the safest routes with the confidence of someone who had traveled these paths before. "There," she said finally, pointing toward a distinctive rock formation about half a mile ahead. "The Buffalo Skull Rocks." Colt had to admit the resemblance was striking. Wind and water had carved the red sandstone into shapes that did indeed suggest a massive skull, complete with eye sockets and what looked like curved horns. It was the kind of landmark that would be easy to remember and difficult to confuse with anything else. They approached the rocks carefully, the horses picking their way through snow-covered boulders and hidden crevices that could break a leg or trap a rider. Up close, the formation was even more impressive, towering perhaps 60 feet into the morning sky, with caves and passages carved deep into the stone by millennia of erosion. "Which cave?" Ironhawk asked. Evangeline studied the rock face, her eyes moving across dozens of potential hiding spots. For a moment, Colt thought she might be having trouble remembering the exact location. Then she pointed to a narrow opening about 20 feet up the cliff face, accessible only by a treacherous climb across icy stone. "There, behind that opening, the passage goes back about 30 feet before opening into a larger chamber. I wrapped the bundle in oiled cloth and hid it behind some loose rocks at the back of the chamber." The climb took nearly an hour, with Evangeline leading the way up the treacherous rock face while Ironhawk followed close behind. The rest of the group waited below, their weapons ready and their eyes scanning the surrounding terrain for any sign of Blackwood's men. After what felt like an eternity, they disappeared into the cave opening. For long minutes, there was no sign of activity. Then Ironhawk's voice echoed across the rocks, speaking in Crow. "He says they found it," Plenty Horses translated. "The thunder bundle is there." Relief washed over Colt like warm water. Whatever else Evangeline might have lied about, she had told the truth about the location of the stolen sacred medicine. That single act of honesty might be enough to save her life and his own. The descent was even more dangerous than the climb, but eventually both figures made it safely to the ground. Ironhawk carried a bundle wrapped in oiled leather, his face showing a mixture of relief and reverence as he held the recovered sacred object. "It is undamaged," he announced to his warriors. "The Thunder Bundle has returned to the people." The Crow warriors surrounded their leader, their faces showing emotions that ranged from joy to solemn satisfaction. For them, this was more than the recovery of stolen property. It was the restoration of spiritual balance that had been disrupted by violence and sacrilege. "What happens now?" Evangeline asked quietly. Ironhawk studied her with eyes that revealed nothing of his intentions. "Now we must decide what justice requires. The bundle is recovered, but the crimes that led to its theft remain unpunished. I've told you everything I know about Blackwood's operation. Doesn't that count for something? Information is not the same as justice. 8 elders died because of your work. Their families deserve more than knowledge about the man who hired their killers." Colt stepped forward, sensing that they were approaching a moment that would determine everyone's fate. "Ironhawk, your people have a reputation for wisdom as well as courage. What would your elders counsel in this situation?" The warrior considered the question carefully. Around them, the morning sun climbed higher into a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for judgment. Traditionally, crimes against the sacred required death or exile. But these are not traditional times, and the woman is not of our people. Her punishment should fit not just her crimes, but the possibility of preventing future crimes. "What do you mean?" Evangeline asked. "You know Blackwood's methods, his routines, his defenses. You know where he keeps the stolen artifacts and how he moves them to buyers. That knowledge could be used to stop him permanently. You want me to help you destroy his entire operation? I want you to choose between personal justice and tribal justice. Face punishment for your own crimes, or help us prevent future crimes against all tribes. But understand, if you choose to help us and then betray us, your death will be certain and unpleasant." Evangeline was quiet for a long moment, her green eyes moving between the recovered Thunder Bundle and the faces of the warriors who held her life in their hands. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "I choose to help. Not because I think it will erase what I've done, but because it's the right thing to do. Then we plan war against a man who profits from murder and theft," Ironhawk declared. The journey back to Colt's cabin took less time than the trip out, but it felt longer because of the weight of what lay ahead. They were planning to assault a fortified position held by 20 experienced fighters, with only 7 people and the element of surprise on their side. As they rode, Evangeline proved her value by providing detailed intelligence about Blackwood's defenses and routines. The colonel's ranch was built like a fortress, with high walls and strategically placed guard positions. However, it had been designed to repel Indian raids, not infiltration by someone who knew its weaknesses. "The artifact storage building is separate from the main house," she explained. "Blackwood is paranoid about fire, so he keeps his collection in a stone building with its own guards. But the guards change shift at midnight, and there's a 15-minute window when the building is less closely watched." "How many artifacts are we talking about?" Colt asked. "Hundreds, maybe thousands. He's been collecting for years, and his buyers pay premium prices for authentic pieces. Sacred pipes, medicine bundles, ceremonial weapons, burial goods from dozens of tribes." Ironhawk's face was grim. "He has turned our ancestors' spirits into merchandise." When they reached his cabin, the planning began in earnest. Maps were drawn in the dirt, escape routes were plotted, and contingencies were discussed with the methodical care of professional soldiers preparing for battle. "The key is coordination," Ironhawk observed. "If we attack in waves, they can defeat us one group at a time. But if we strike simultaneously at multiple points, we can create enough confusion to accomplish our objectives." "What about the artifacts?" Plenty Horses asked. "We cannot carry hundreds of sacred objects on horseback during a running fight. We don't need to carry them all, Colt said. We need to recover what we can and destroy the rest rather than let Blackwood sell them. Better that sacred objects return to the earth than be displayed in some collector's parlor. When do we attack? Running Wolf asked, his young face eager for battle. Tonight, Iron Hawk decided. Every day we wait gives Blackwood more time to discover what happened to his agent. We move at moonrise. The moon hung like a silver coin in the star-drunk sky as 7 riders approached the darkness where Blackwood's ranch waited like a sleeping predator. They had traveled for 3 hours through terrain that seemed designed to break horses and men alike, rocky draws, hidden gullies, and slopes covered with loose shale. They halted on a ridge overlooking Blackwood's compound, studying their target through the cold mountain air. The ranch spread below them like a small city, surrounded by high wooden walls and dotted with guard towers that rose like skeletal fingers against the night sky. Lights burned in several buildings: the main house, the bunkhouse, and what had to be the artifact storage building Evangeline had described. Shadows moved across some of the windows, suggesting the guards were alert and active despite the late hour. 12 buildings inside the compound, Colt whispered, studying the layout through his field glasses. Guard towers at each corner, plus roving patrols. I count at least 6 men visible, probably twice that many we can't see. Iron Hawk passed word to his warriors in their own language, his voice barely audible even at close range. The plan they had developed was complex enough to require precise timing, but simple enough that it could survive the chaos of combat. Running Wolf and one of the brothers would create a distraction at the main gate, drawing guards away from other positions. Meanwhile, Colt and Iron Hawk would infiltrate the storage building from the east wall. Plenty horses and the remaining warrior would secure their escape route and watch for reinforcements. Evangeline would remain with the horses, ready to guide them to safety through terrain only she knew well. They separated according to plan, each group moving toward their assigned positions through darkness that felt thick as velvet. Colt found himself alongside Iron Hawk as they worked their way down the steep slope toward the east wall, their boots finding purchase on loose rock and scattered pine needles. The wall was 12 feet high and topped with sharpened stakes, formidable but not impossible for men with climbing experience. They reached the base without being detected, pressing themselves against the rough wooden planks while they listened for guards on the other side. Footsteps passed overhead, moving with the regular rhythm of a bored sentry walking his assigned route. They waited until the sound faded, then Iron Hawk produced a rope and grappling hook from his gear. The hook caught on the third throw, its metal tines finding purchase between 2 of the defensive stakes. Iron Hawk tested the rope with his full weight before beginning his climb, moving up the wall with the fluid grace of a man who had scaled cliffs and canyon walls since childhood. They dropped into the compound and moved across open ground with the careful steps of men who understood that discovery would mean death. The distance to the storage building was perhaps 50 yards, but it felt like miles as they dodged from shadow to shadow, avoiding the pools of lamplight that marked guard positions. At the building's east wall, they found the weakness Evangeline had described, a small window at ground level, probably meant for ventilation, that had been left unbarred because it was too narrow for normal human passage. Iron Hawk removed his coat and weapons, then squeezed through the window opening like water flowing through a narrow channel. Long minutes passed before the window opened wider from the inside, the wooden frame having been pried loose by careful pressure. Colt slipped through the enlarged window and found himself in a room that made his stomach turn with disgust and anger. Artifacts filled every available space, medicine bundles hanging from pegs, ceremonial weapons mounted on walls, sacred pipes arranged in glass cases like museum displays. But it was the burial goods that truly sickened him. Clothing and ornaments that had been buried with the dead, removed from graves by men who saw profit in desecration. Some items still carried tags identifying their tribal origins and the circumstances of their acquisition. notes that read like confessions to grave robbing. How do we choose what to take? Ironhawk asked, his voice tight with controlled rage. We take what we can carry and destroy the rest, Colt replied. Better that these things return to the earth and continue to be sold like merchandise. They worked quickly, selecting the most sacred items, medicine bundles, ceremonial objects, and burial goods that could be easily transported. Everything else would have to be destroyed, a necessity that felt like compounding the original crime, but was better than leaving the artifacts in Blackwood's hands. As they gathered what they could carry, footsteps echoed from the floor above. Multiple sets, moving with purpose rather than the random pattern of routine patrol. They know we're here, Colt whispered. But as Colt reached the window, lantern light blazed through the building's main entrance. Men's voices echoed through the stone corridors, and the sound of running boots suggested their presence had been discovered. Too late for stealth, Ironhawk observed, drawing his knife. The first guard appeared in the doorway just as Colt was climbing through the window. The man raised his rifle, but Ironhawk was already moving, crossing the room in 3 quick strides and driving his blade between the guard's ribs before the weapon could be aimed. More voices echoed from the corridor as Colt dropped to the ground outside. He turned to help Ironhawk through the window, but gunfire erupted from inside the building, the sound echoing off stone walls like thunder in a canyon. Ironhawk appeared at the window, blood streaming from a wound on his forehead. He passed through the sacred bundles they had gathered, then squeezed through the opening as more shots rang out behind him. They ran across the compound's open ground, no longer trying for stealth but simply trying to reach the wall before Blackwood's men could organize an effective pursuit. Behind them, the storage building blazed with light as guards searched for additional intruders. The rope still hung from the wall where they had left it, but climbing would take precious seconds they might not have. As if reading his thoughts, Ironhawk produced a small cloth bag from his belt. "Gift from my grandfather," he said, striking sparks with flint and steel. "When we reach the top, throw this back at the storage building." The bag contained black powder and metal fragments, a crude but effective explosive that would serve their purposes perfectly. If they couldn't carry all the sacred artifacts to safety, at least they could ensure Blackwood couldn't profit from them either. They scaled the wall as shouts echoed across the compound and men with lanterns began searching the shadows where they had hidden. At the top, Ironhawk lit the fuse on his improvised bomb and hurled it toward the stone building with the accuracy of a man who had been throwing weapons since childhood. The explosion lit up the night like artificial dawn, sending fragments of stone and burning debris across the compound. The storage building's windows shattered, and flames began to lick at the wooden interior structures that held Blackwood's stolen collection. "Now we run," Ironhawk said with satisfaction. They dropped down the outside of the wall just as the building's roof caught fire, the flames visible for miles across the dark landscape. Whatever artifacts they hadn't been able to carry were being consumed by the blaze, returning to earth and sky rather than continuing their exile in collectors' parlors. The horses were waiting where they had left them, with Evangeline holding the reins and scanning the darkness for signs of pursuit. Her face showed relief when she saw them approaching, but her expression quickly turned to concern when she noticed Ironhawk's bleeding head wound. "How bad?" she asked. "I'll live to see sunrise," he replied, "which is more than I can say for Blackwood's collection." Behind them, the entire compound was now alive with activity as men fought the fire that threatened to spread to other buildings. The distraction had worked better than they had hoped, too well perhaps, since it meant Blackwood would know he had been deliberately attacked rather than simply burglarized. "Where are the others?" Colt asked. "Running Wolf and his partner are coming." Evangeline pointed toward the main gate, where 2 figures were moving quickly through the darkness. "But I think they stirred up more trouble than they expected." The young warriors reached the horses just as the sound of organized pursuit began echoing from the compound. Blackwood's men were mounting up, preparing to track the raiders across terrain that favored defenders who knew every rock and gully. "How much did you recover?" Plenty Horses asked, studying the bundles they had managed to carry away from the burning storage building. "Perhaps a dozen sacred objects," Iron Hawk replied, "including 3 medicine bundles and a burial shirt that belonged to a chief. Not everything, but enough to matter." "And the rest?" "Returning to the spirits in smoke and flame. Better that way than in the hands of men who see them as curiosities." They mounted quickly and rode hard into the darkness, following escape routes Evangeline had scouted during their earlier reconnaissance. Behind them, the glow of the burning storage building painted the sky red, and the sound of pursuit grew closer with each passing minute. The chase lasted until dawn, a running battle across terrain that tested both horses and riders to their limits. Blackwood's men were skilled and determined, but they were following trails through country where the Crow warriors held every advantage of knowledge and experience. As the sun rose over the Wyoming mountains, painting the peaks gold and rose, Colt found himself on a ridge overlooking the valley where his cabin stood. Below them, their pursuers had finally given up the chase, their horses blown and their ammunition running low. "It's over," Evangeline said, slumping in her saddle with exhaustion. "This part is over," Iron Hawk corrected. "But Blackwood will rebuild, and other men like him will continue stealing from the graves and sacred places of my people. The war continues." They rode down into the valley as the morning sun climbed higher, its warmth beginning to melt the snow that had fallen during the previous day's storm. At his cabin, Colt unsaddled his horse and turned it into the small corral, already thinking about the changes he would need to make to his life. Word of the attack on Blackwood's ranch would spread quickly through the territory. Cavalry patrols would investigate, territorial officials would ask questions, and his quiet existence as a mountain hermit would become impossible to maintain. "What will you do now?" he asked Evangeline. She considered the question while studying the recovered sacred bundles that Iron Hawk was preparing for transport back to his people. "Find another way to make a living, I suppose. One that doesn't involve stealing from the dead or lying to men who offer shelter to strangers in storms. The tribal council will want to speak with you," Iron Hawk said. "Your crimes require formal judgment, even though you helped recover what was stolen." "I understand. I'm ready to face whatever punishment your people decide is appropriate." Plenty Horses approached carrying the bundle that contained his brother's sacred objects, items that had been stolen from the Winter Count Keeper's grave and sold to Blackwood's collection. "My brother's spirit can rest now," he said simply. "That matters more than revenge." As the Crow warriors prepared to depart, taking both Evangeline and the recovered artifacts back to their tribal lands, Colt found himself facing a decision that would determine the rest of his life. He could remain in his mountain exile, rebuild his solitude, and pretend that none of this had ever happened. Or he could follow the example set by men who understood that some fights were worth the cost of fighting them. "Iron Hawk," he called out as the warriors mounted their horses. "Yes?" "If your people need someone who understands both white and Indian ways of war, someone who knows how men like Blackwood think and operate, you know where to find me." The warrior studied Colt's face for a long moment before nodding. "The offer is remembered. Perhaps someday it will be needed." They rode away across the snow-covered valley, 7 figures growing smaller against the vast landscape until they disappeared beyond the distant ridge. Colt stood in front of his cabin, watching until even the dust of their passage had settled, then turned to face the solitude that had been his companion for 3 years. But something had changed during the long night of fire and pursuit. The silence that had once felt like peace now seemed empty, lacking the weight of purpose that came from fighting for something larger than personal comfort. He looked up at the mountains that surrounded his valley, their peaks white with snow and sharp against the morning sky. Somewhere beyond those peaks, other men like Blackwood were turning sacred objects into merchandise, and other artifacts were waiting to be recovered and returned to their proper places. The war for justice might never end, but perhaps that was exactly why good men couldn't afford to sit it out. Colt Brennan walked back into his cabin, but he was already planning for the day when he might ride out of it again, toward whatever battles waited beyond the mountain passes. The door that Evangeline Morrison had knocked on in desperation had opened more than just shelter from a storm. It had opened the way back to a war that mattered, fought for people whose spirits deserved better than exile in strangers' parlors. And for the first time in 3 years, that felt like enough.